You have heard the story of the beginning. You have heard it whispered in the cradle, read from dust-covered pages, and echoed in the vast chambers of history. We have all heard of the perfect garden, bathed in eternal light, and of the first human pair. We have heard of the glistening fruit, the serpent with its silver tongue, and of a paradise gate that slammed shut forever, locked behind them by a sword of living flame. It is the story of loss, the primal tragedy that has defined our fate. But what if I told you that the greatest tragedy was not the expulsion from Eden? What if the real catastrophe was the anthem that fell silent in its wake? What if the silence that descended upon Adam and Eve the moment they stepped beyond the gate was heavier than the cherubim's judgment, more searing than the fiery sword itself? A silence that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of a new, cavernous void, a chasm that had just been born between two souls who were once one. We often look to the Garden of Eden as a lost place, a golden memory of a time that can never be again. We paint pictures of its honeyed rivers, its boughs heavy with fruit, and its gentle beasts. But could it be that this view has tragically diminished, a concept far grander? Could it be that Eden was not merely a location on some cosmic map, but a dimension of being? A perfect symphony where every note from the rustle of a leaf to the beat of a heart existed in flawless harmony. A state where creature and creator breathed in the same rhythm, where the concepts of I and you did not exist, only we, in an eternal, seamless unity. A ceaseless dance of life, where every entity was an inseparable part of the whole. And if that is true, then the forbidden fruit did not just take away a home, it stole an entire symphony. It silenced the orchestra of the cosmos, leaving behind a deafening stillness. The choice made by Eve, and then Adam, was not merely an act of disobedience. It was the pulling of a single, essential thread from the universal tapestry, causing the entire fabric to unravel into the frayed strands of isolation. Today, we will not journey back in time to search for a forgotten woman in the footnotes of folklore. We will move forward into the profound darkness that fell immediately after that fateful moment. We will not try to hear what was said, but will attune our ears to the silence itself, to find the echoes hidden deep within it. Because the truth of what was truly lost, of the terrifying price of knowledge, and of the cosmic gambit that was so intricately set, is far more complex and heartbreaking than you have ever known. We will discover that sometimes the most important stories are told in the spaces between the words. Are you prepared to step into the land of echoes, where the most beautiful anthem in the universe was silenced, leaving only a soul-crushing stillness? Do you dare to face the truth that the greatest fall was not a shout of defiance, but a whispered song that was extinguished? Let us begin this journey together, for the first chapter of the human story was not written in ink nor carved in stone, but was composed in the heavy, shared silence of the first two people to walk under an alien sky, with an invisible but uncrossable distance now between them. A faint image materializes. The silhouettes of Adam and Eve, their hands mechanically clasped, walk across a barren, desolate landscape under a blood-red sunset. The wind whips Eve's long hair, wrapping around her like a shroud. Adam walks with shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the ground, as if it could anchor him from dissolving into nothing. They do not look at each other. They do not speak, and between their joined hands lies a cold universe of separation. To truly comprehend that terrifying silence, the silence that became humanity's first inheritance, we must first look back at the one who sowed its seeds. The scriptures call it the serpent, a name that has become synonymous with deception and primordial evil. For centuries, we have painted its portrait as a slithering creature, with cunning eyes and a forked tongue whispering lies. We see it as a puppet of darkness, a tool of evil sent to sabotage God's perfect creation. But could it be that this view, while safe and clear-cut, has dangerously oversimplified an entity of far greater depth and purpose? Let us for a moment peel back the layers of myth and imagine another possibility. Imagine the serpent not as a blind vandal, but as a cosmic philosopher, a sower of doubt. An ancient entity, perhaps existing long before dust was shaped into man, a keen intellect who observed the absolute harmony of Eden and saw in it a flaw, not a flaw in its perfection, but a flaw in its lack of choice. It looked upon the innocent unity of Adam and Eve and saw not beauty, but a pre-programmed existence, an obedience that held no value because the alternative was unknown. From that perspective, its objective was not to lure Adam and Eve into moral decay for the satisfaction of some dark master. It was a grander game, a philosophical experiment conducted on the stage of creation itself. Its gambit was based on a single, cold, and ruthless hypothesis: that divine unity, the seamless bond between creature and creator, can only exist in a state of innocence, and that the moment the seed of the self, of self-awareness, is planted, the moment a creature recognizes its own separation from everything around it, that symphony will shatter itself into the dissonant notes of ego and fear. It did not approach Eve with promises of worldly power or riches. Such concepts had no meaning in Eden. Instead, it attacked the very core of perception. It did not command, it posed a question. Did God really say? That seemingly innocuous question was the most sophisticated weapon imaginable. It did not assault Eve's loyalty. It assaulted the very foundation of the reality she inhabited. For the first time in all of existence, the concept of an alternative perspective, the possibility that reality might not be singular and absolute, was introduced. It was a microfracture in the flawless glass of absolute trust, a small tremor powerful enough to destabilize the entire structure. The serpent did not need to push them, it only needed to hand them the mirror of self-awareness. And it knew, with its ancient intellect, that the nature of looking in a mirror is that you can never again forget your own reflection. Once seen, you cannot be unseen. Its gambit was not aimed at the death of the human body, but at the death of their unified soul. And in a way, it won. Or perhaps, it merely initiated another chapter of the story, one whose consequences even its ancient mind could not fully anticipate. Perhaps, in its victory, it inadvertently opened a path for a different kind of beauty, one born from brokenness itself. A question that still hangs, suspended in the heavy air of the world after Eden. What then was this knowledge of good and evil promised by the forbidden fruit, the knowledge for which an entire paradise was traded? We tend to interpret it literally, as a moral compass, the ability to distinguish right from wrong. But let us pause and reflect. Before the fruit, Adam and Eve possessed the most perfect moral compass, the most unerring guide, the direct, unmediated presence of the Creator. They lived and breathed within His will. They had no need to know evil, because in their dimension of being evil, the opposition to God's will simply did not exist as a concept. So what knowledge did the fruit impart? The answer may lie not in the words good and evil, but in the word knowing. It was not a knowledge of ethics, but a knowledge of being. To understand this, try to imagine their state beforehand. Before the fruit, Adam and Eve had no concept of self as a separate entity. They were a part of the garden, as a leaf is part of a tree, as a wave is part of the ocean. They lacked the self-consciousness to look at themselves from the outside. This is why they were naked and felt no shame. Nakedness only has meaning when there is an other to compare oneself to, when there is an external, judging eye, and most importantly, when there is the judging eye of the self. They existed in a pure flow of unity, with no division between subject and object. The knowledge from the fruit was, therefore, the knowledge of separation. The very instant the fruit touched their lips, first Eve's and then Adam's, a terrifying transformation occurred in their consciousness. For the first time in their eternal existence, they saw the I. Adam looked at Eve and, instead of seeing a part of himself, a harmonious reflection, he saw another, a separate being with her own will, her own thoughts. Eve looked at Adam and recognized that same division. And most horrifically of all, they looked inward and recognized themselves. They saw themselves as individuals, separate from the garden, separate from the animals, separate from each other, and most dreadfully, separate from their Creator. They saw themselves as naked, vulnerable, and finite. This was the moment shame was born. The primal shame was not embarrassment over the physical body, but the existential terror of sudden spiritual isolation, the feeling of being thrown out of the flow of unity and left to stand alone. And this was also when fear was conceived. The first fear was not of punishment, but of the sudden awareness of cessation, of an endpoint, of death. Before, they lived in the tree of life, in eternity. Now they had tasted the knowledge of their own finitude. That knowledge was not a gift of empowerment. It was a veil being brutally ripped away, exposing a cold, fragmented reality full of boundaries. They had traded eternal unity for solitary self-awareness. It was a price beyond measure. The taste of the fruit, one might imagine, was not sweet like its appearance suggested. Perhaps it held the bitterness of the first tear that ever rolled down a cheek, the saltiness of the sweat that would soon bead on a brow toiling against thorny ground, and the profound cold of a grave not yet dug, but now looming as an inescapable destiny. In the heart of the Garden of Eden, where life flowed at its most potent, stood not one, but two symbolic trees, two beacons of destiny, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Their parallel existence poses one of the most profound and debated mysteries in the entire creation narrative. Why were there two trees? Why was a choice with such cosmic consequences presented in a world that was already perfect? The answer, perhaps, is that these were not merely plants with supernatural properties. They were two paths, two blueprints for humanity's destiny, two philosophies of living embodied in arboreal form. They represented a fundamental fork in the road of existence itself. Consider the tree of life. It stood vibrant and radiant, the very icon of the path of eternal communion. To live by its fruit was to live by connection, by total dependence on the life source flowing from the Creator. It was an existence without ego, without self-questioning, without doubt. A life like a river, flowing ever onward to the sea without asking why, because the flowing itself was its meaning. It promised eternity, but an eternity of blissful dissolution, of absolute unity. In stark contrast stood the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This tree, however alluring its fruit, represented a completely different path, the path of autonomous selfhood and individuation. To live by its knowledge was to live by one's own power, by the ability to self-judge, self-analyze, and self-choose. It was the birth of the independent I, a life like a flame, brilliant, intense, and capable of giving light, but one that is ultimately finite, consuming itself to sustain its own existence. It promised the power of knowledge and the freedom of will, but at the cost of finitude, struggle, and solitude. It is crucial to note that God did not forbid the tree of life. He placed it there, in the center, an open invitation, the default choice. The only warning, stark and unequivocal, was about the tree of knowledge. For when you eat from it, you will certainly die. Why this warning? Perhaps because he, in his infinite wisdom, knew that these two paths were mutually exclusive within a single creature. Once humanity tasted self-awareness, once they chose the path of the flame, they could never return to the innocent communion of the river. Once you know you are a separate individual, you cannot unknow it. Therefore, the choice made by Adam and Eve was not merely an act of disobedience. It was an existential choice, a fateful decision about the very nature of being they desired for themselves and all who would follow. They chose the path of the flame over the path of the river. And this is precisely why, after their choice was made, the cherubim with the flaming sword had to guard the way to the tree of life. That act was not an additional punishment, it was a protection. For the combination of a finite, fearful, and selfish ego with eternal life, devoid of redemption, would have created a reality more horrific than death itself. A hell of endless existence in a state of unbreakable pain and separation. It was an act of mercy disguised as a judgment. In the tragic indictment of humanity, the spotlight of blame has so often fallen squarely upon Eve. She was the one who listened to the serpent's whisper, the first to be captivated by the fruit's appearance, and the one whose hand first reached out to pluck it. For millennia, she has been framed as a symbol of weakness, of gullibility, and as the very origin of all suffering. But perhaps her true role, in the aftermath of that fateful moment, is far more profound, complex, and tragic. Perhaps we should see Eve not as the sinner, but as the keeper of broken memories. When the seismic shock of the knowledge of separation struck, it shattered the perfect architecture of Eden within their souls. But in any shattering, there are always fragments left behind. A small shard of the old symphony, a faint echo of the lost unity, a dim afterglow of the pure light. And it was likely Eve, not Adam, who carried these fragments most vividly within her. Why her? Because she stood at the epicenter of the transformation. She was the one who engaged in dialogue with the sower of doubt, who weighed its words, and who first felt the fabric of reality shudder as she brought the fruit to her lips. She was the first point of contact between the two worlds, between innocence and knowledge. Therefore, it stands to reason that she would be the one to feel most acutely, most painfully, what had been lost. As the new world of thorns and toil took shape around them, as Adam grappled with the earth and the burden of reality, a small corner of Eve's soul may have remained a secret garden of memory, a place where she could still remember the feeling of a sun that warmed without scorching, of a breeze that carried melody instead of a hiss, of a peace that required no words, and above all, the feeling of being one with everything. Every wildflower that fought its way through the barren soil was not just a symbol of life, but a stark contrast to the effortless blooms of Eden. The divine decree, "I will make your pains in childbearing very severe," may carry a dual meaning, far deeper than physical agony. That pain was also the metaphysical anguish of bringing into existence a generation that would never know the complete song. Every child born, from Cain to Abel and beyond, was a hope, but also a living testament to the separation that had occurred. Eve, called the mother of all the living, became the mother of a generation carrying a hereditary nostalgia for a home they had never seen, a yearning for a wholeness they could not define. She was the keeper of a shattered legacy, tasked with passing down the broken pieces of a story no one could ever fully put back together. And what of Adam? He stood there, beside Eve, in the silence of their newly shattered world. He was not the one directly tempted, but he was there. He saw, he heard, and ultimately he made his choice. To join Eve on the new path, the path of knowledge and division. What then was his role in the aftermath? If Eve became the keeper of memory's fragments, then Adam, by his very nature, became the bearer of the new reality. His role was not to remember, but to confront. Try for a moment to imagine the weight that settled upon his shoulders, shoulders that had previously known only the gentle air of Eden. He was formed from the dust, not to toil, but to tend and to rule. He was the first king of a perfect kingdom, where everything, from the mighty lion to the tiny hummingbird, followed a harmonious order. His power came not from physical strength, but from his seamless alignment with creation. The naming of the animals was not a task. It was an act that affirmed his deep understanding of and connection to every living thing. Now, that harmony was broken like a mirror. The new reality was cold and unforgiving. The earth no longer yielded its fruit willingly to him. Instead, it would now produce thorns and thistles. Labor was no longer a joyful act of creation, a dance with nature, but a relentless struggle for survival. The pronouncement by the sweat of your brow, "You will eat your food," was not just a description of agriculture, it was a new definition of human existence, one based on effort, opposition, and exhaustion. Adam's burden was not merely physical. The psychological weight was perhaps even more crushing. It was the burden of failure. He was the king who had lost his kingdom, not to an external enemy, but to an internal choice. He was the shepherd who had let his entire flock, including himself, wander into a desolate wilderness fraught with peril. Every day, as he looked at his calloused, dirt-caked hands, he saw not just soil and blisters. He saw the reflection of a fallen monarch, a steward who had failed to protect the most precious trust he was given. And perhaps his greatest burden, the most silent and persistent of all, was the act of looking at Eve. Looking into the eyes of the woman he had once joyfully declared, "Bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh," and seeing there a distant sorrow, a memory he could only vaguely sense but never truly touch. He knew she was remembering something they had lost together, but only she could still hear its faint echo. The silence between them, during the long evenings after a day of exhausting labor, was not an absence of love, but the presence of an unfillable void, a chasm named Eden. Adam had to build a new world on the ashes of a perfect one, and he had to do it with a heart that now knew loss, a soul that carried the weight of leading humanity down the very path he had helped to pave. Amidst the foundational and tragic story of Adam and Eve, in ancient, non-canonical texts and forgotten whispers of folklore, another name sometimes resounds an echo from a different dimension of possibility: Lilith. The old tales, particularly in Jewish tradition, often speak of her as Adam's first wife, created from the same earth, his equal in every way. They tell of how she refused to be subservient, how she spoke the sacred name and flew into the barren desert, choosing freedom in solitude over harmony in subjugation. But in the new context of the story, we are exploring a story of internal schism and the price of knowledge. Lilith's role, perhaps, takes on an even deeper and more essential symbolic meaning. Let us try to see Lilith not as a historical figure to be verified, but as the echo of a different destiny. She is the embodiment of a third path, a potential choice, a road never explored within the drama of the Garden of Eden. If the Tree of Life represented the path of absolute communion in innocence, and the Tree of Knowledge represented the path of selfhood and struggle in relationship, then the path of Lilith was the path of absolute freedom and absolute solitude. She did not play the game set upon the board with its two central trees. She overturned the board and walked away. She chose neither unity in dependence nor division in relationship. She chose an independent existence, defining herself without reference to another. She was a self-contained universe, orbiting no sun but her own. Her existence, even as a myth, poses a profound philosophical question to the human story. What if humanity had not been created in a pair, in a relationship of both completion and conflict? What if each individual had been a singular universe, needing no reflection from another to exist? It would be a world without romantic love, but also without betrayal. A world without companionship, but also without the pain of loss. Lilith is not the answer. She is a great question, a variable removed from the equation. She is the ghost of a choice that was never offered to Eve. While Eve grappled with the burdens of relationship and memory, Lilith roamed a different reality, one of untethered power. But what was the price of that power? Perhaps it was an eternal loneliness, a shout with no one to hear it in the vast wilderness, a freedom that feels empty because there is nothing to be free from. Her absence from the central narrative of Scripture is likely not an oversight or an act of censorship. Perhaps her absence is deliberate. It serves to emphasize that humanity's story, for some divine reason, was destined to be a story of relationship. It is a story of connection, of rupture, and of the journey toward reconciliation. It is not the story of absolute independence. Lilith exists on the margins as an eternal reminder of the path not taken, a different destiny, a wild and solitary echo that resounds forever from just beyond the garden walls. If the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge planted the seed of spiritual division in the fertile soil of the human soul, then the tragic story of Cain and Abel is where that seed bore its first poisonous fruit in the physical world. The first murder was not merely a crime between two brothers. It was a cosmic event, a terrible escalation of the fall that began in the garden. It was the moment that the internal division, the jealousy, the sense of injustice, the wounded pride, all emotions born of the newly formed I spilled outward, no longer contained within thought and feeling. It manifested as a violent act that stained the very earth, a ground that had previously known only life. God's words to Cain, "The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground," carry a terrifying weight. Blood is not just a biological fluid, it is the symbol of life, of covenant. And for the first time in history, that sacred current was intentionally stopped by a human hand, ending a divine flow. The earth drank blood, and its cry shook the foundations of the new order. And what of the consequence of that act, the mark of Cain? We often imagine it as a physical scar, a strange tattoo, a visible sign for all to recognize and shun him. But could its meaning be more profound, more metaphysical than that? Could it be that the mark was not something one could see with the eyes, but a change in the very nature of Cain's existence? Imagine that the mark was a fracture in Cain's very reality. After his act, he was no longer a part of the natural rhythm. He had, by his own hand, stepped outside the symphony of humanity, broken as it was. He became a dissonant note, an alien presence. His connection to the earth, the very source of his father's being, was severed. The ground would no longer yield its crops to him willingly, for it recognized him as the one who had defiled it. He was condemned to be a restless wanderer on the earth, not because he had no home, but because no place would truly accept him as a part of it anymore. The deepest, most cruel irony of this mark is that it was not meant to punish him through the scorn of others. On the contrary, the scripture is clear that it protected him from being killed. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. The mark, therefore, was the sentence of absolute isolation. He was allowed to live, but forced to live within a reality permanently distorted by his own action. He was to wander, forever haunted by the cry of the blood he had spilled, forever a stranger everywhere he went. It was the final, irreversible expression of separation. Separated from God, separated from family, separated from the earth, and ultimately separated from his own human essence. Cain did not just bear a mark, he became the mark, a living warning of the price paid when the division in the soul is allowed to become violence in the hand. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. This brief sentence in Genesis has opened one of the most intriguing mysteries for theologians and readers throughout the centuries. Where was this land of Nod? And more importantly, who were its inhabitants, from whom Cain could find a wife? First, let us consider the name itself. In ancient Hebrew, the root of the word nad means to wander, to be restless. It is possible, then, that Nod was not a specific geographical location on a map, not a valley or a plateau to be found. Perhaps Nod was a state of being, a dimension of existence created by Cain's own choice and action. Nod was the realm of exiles, a world defined by its complete severance from the source, a reality where the echo of Eden had finally gone silent. It was the world of those who must create their own meaning in a universe that seemed empty and silent. And so, the classic question arises, where did Cain get his wife? Rather than postulating a pre-Adamic race created in parallel, a theory that might complicate the foundational story of a single human origin, let us consider another possibility, one more symbolic and consistent with the narrative of separation we have been following. Could it be that the inhabitants of Nod were themselves the other echoes of the Great Division, souls born from the very fracture in reality that Cain had created? They were not descendants of Adam and Eve in a biological sense, but rather manifestations of a humanity that had completely lost even a broken memory of Eden. They were the people of the new reality, born into struggle, unaware of the existence of the old song. They were the humanity east of Eden, a people accustomed to the thorny ground and the silent sky. From this perspective, Cain's wife need not be his lost sister. She could have been the first of this Nod generation. A woman who had never known the innocence of the garden, whose eyes held not the sadness of loss, but the resilience of a survivor. She did not know unity, she only knew existence. The meeting between her and Cain was a meeting of two different kinds of tragedy. Their marriage was not just a union of two people, but a fusion of two experiences. The pain of the one who knew what he had lost, Cain, and the stoic emptiness of the one who did not know what she was missing, his wife. And from that union, the first city, Enoch, was built. The act of building a city is profoundly symbolic. It is humanity's attempt to create an artificial garden, a new order with walls for protection and rules for conduct. It is an effort to mask the chaos within and the aimless wandering without. The first city of mankind was not built from joy and creative expression, as when Adam named the animals, but was built from fear, isolation, and the need for a sanctuary within the realm of exiles. So, after all this brokenness, this loss, this burden, and these sorrowful echoes, where does our story end? Is it simply an indictment of humanity's failure, a tragedy with no final act, a repeating cycle of division passed from one generation to the next? If one looks only at the surface, it might seem so. But perhaps all this time we have been misreading the message. Perhaps we have been so focused on what was lost that we have failed to see what was born from that very loss. Perhaps the expulsion from Eden was not the end of the human story. It was the beginning of a completely different kind of story. A story no longer about a perfection that was gifted unconditionally, but about a redemption that must be earned. A story no longer about innocence, but about maturity. The symphony of unity, the perfect music of Eden, was indeed shattered into countless pieces. But from those very fragments, from the ensuing silence, a new melody, an unfinished anthem, began to be composed. This is the song of humanity. Its melody is not perfect. It is full of the low notes of pain, the dissonant chords of regret, and the frantic rhythms of struggle. But it also contains the soaring high notes of sacrificial love, the quiet rests of compassion, the resolving harmonies of forgiveness, and the crescendos of a hope that refuses to be extinguished. The fall, perhaps, was not an accident in God's plan. It is possible it was part of the plan itself, a painful but necessary part. It was to allow humanity, from within its own division and finitude, from its own knowledge of good and evil, to make a choice of true significance, the choice to return to Him. A choice made in knowledge, not in innocence, carries an infinitely deeper value and beauty. Love is only valuable when one has the capacity not to love. Loyalty is only meaningful when the option of betrayal exists. The story of Adam and Eve, therefore, is not a bitter reminder of what we have lost. It is a profound reminder of who we are, complex, contradictory beings who carry within us both the faint memory of a perfect garden and the tangible weight of a broken reality. We live in the space between those two worlds, between a past of unity and a present of separation, with a future full of potential. And our task, your task, and my task is not to try to rebuild the walls of an unreachable Eden, nor to drown in sorrow for a silenced song. Our task is to contribute our own notes, whether joyful or mournful, whether strong or faint, to this unfinished anthem. It is to create, in the very silence of the world, in the very solitude of our souls, a new sound, a sound of connection found through separation, a sound of redemption built not from perfection, but from the very broken pieces of our own hearts. Your journey, and my journey, is not an exile, it is a composition, and that, perhaps, is the most beautiful and profound hidden truth of all, a truth whispered not by the serpent, but written into the very fabric of our lives.